Organization is her.
With the help of the Almighty, we just attended a delegation of rabbis from around the world who are Jews, true to Judaism, and therefore we oppose Zionism and the State of Israel, which is a transformation from the religion to nationalism. They've hijacked our name.
Yeah.
Jews are not to have a state, they're forbidden for us, and Jews are not to steal the land from the Palestinians. And we had rabbis from Palestine, from around the world. I'm from the US and from Canada, from UK, who speaks the word of Jews that it is forbidden for us to the occupation of Palestine. It is against the will of the indigenous Jewish people of Palestine, and it has always been opposed by the rabbinical authorities, and we pray for the speedy and total and peaceful dismantlement of the state. The world, unfortunately, thinks that this is a religious conflict, that it's the Muslims who are anti-Semites, hate the Jews. This is abhorrent. It's not true. Jews have always enjoyed the hospitality of the Muslim countries. And here in Qatar, it was a perfect example and of showing the friendship of to the Jewish people from the Muslim people, and to clarify to the world that all the religions are opposed to this occupation with God's help. And we hope it'll be a catalyst of clarifying to the world that the opposition is to the flawed and illegitimate political Zionist movement that has taken the land against the will of the people. We pray, as I say, for a speedy and total and peaceful dismantlement of this impediment to peace, the State of Israel, so we can live again in peace and harmony.
Okay, that's right. Thank you.
Hi friends, this is Red Eyes Radio. I'm Henrik from Sweden. I hope your weekend was good. It's always a pleasure to have you with us and to be able to speak with you. You can hear new shows 3 times per week at our website, redeyescreations.com, and also, of course, our members website, redeyesmembers.com, where we have our full archives. We also make videos and have a busy news section, so do pay us a visit if you like what we do. Well, today we have an important program on the plagiarism and fraud of Albert Einstein. We are going to break down his purported discoveries in physics and examine more in detail who this man really was. In the second hour, we are going to talk about how his fame in science made him weigh in on matters of politics, especially Zionism. Our guest is Christopher Jon Bjerknes. He is a writer and a researcher who has published numerous books and articles on the history of the theory of relativity, Einstein Zionism, and also on the Armenian Genocide. His work has provoked enormous controversy, and his books have been reviewed in mainstream publications by leading academics in their fields, including John Stachel, the first editor of the Einstein Papers Project, and Stephen Leonard Jacobs, the first vice president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. We have a lot to discuss today, including Einstein's partner in crime and first wife, Mileva Einstein-Marity, and their relationship, also the controversy surrounding Einstein's Nobel Prize, and so much more. Good show ahead, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for coming on, Christopher. A pleasure to finally connect with you. You know, I probably heard you first on a show about 10 years ago, I think, and I've always wanted to get you on the show, so it's been many years now. So great to finally connect with you, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for your persistence, and it is wonderful to appear on your program. Thank you for inviting me.
You bet. Thank you so much. Now, we have a lot of your work to discuss here today, a lot to catch up on, because obviously you've been producing more and more material, writing more and more books and whatnot, but I do kind of want to start at the beginning a bit so our audience are caught up to speed in case we have some new listeners with us and whatnot as well. So first, just out the gates, tell us about your interest in Einstein and when this began.
I have relatives who were famous in the history of meteorology and physics, and one of them, Carl Anton Bjerknes, had some theories about electromagnetics and gravitational fields and forces in the ether that interested me. And I wanted to look into the more modern theories of the general theory of relativity and the special theory of relativity so that I could compare and contrast those ideas, because I knew that the theory of relativity had largely rejected the concept of an ether. And one of the first books I came across was a book called The Principle of Relativity, which was a compilation of papers by Einstein, Lorentz, and Minkowski. And I noted in that book that Lorentz had anticipated most of the major aspects of the special theory of relativity. And it struck me that Einstein's paper included no footnotes to the work of Lorentz, although Lorentz's name is mentioned. And I began to investigate that and discovered that not only had Albert Einstein plagiarized the work of Lorentz, he had also plagiarized the work of Poincaré and countless other significant figures in the history of physics.
Interesting. So you were well versed in some areas of physics. Did you study this yourself, or was it more of a kind of an interest on the side?
It was more of an interest on the side. And as I began to explore this with people on the internet, and especially on Usenet, which was very big back then, I discovered many other people who had followed the same journey of reading that book and discovering that Einstein was not fair to those whose work he repeated. And we entered into discussions, and then people from Caltech and other places came on to defend Einstein, and they started to attack all of us as if we were anti-Semites.
Of course.
And that struck me as very odd, because my grandfather on my mother's side was at least half Jewish, and I hadn't ever experienced anything like this before. But when I began to investigate Einstein's history, I discovered that he was a Zionist, and that this behavior was very typical, and it was referred to as the Einstein terror. And they would literally terrorize people from the 1920s on, whoever tried to question Einstein's priority or question the theory of relativity. And this became so fervent that in the Soviet Union, anyone who questioned Einstein or the theory of relativity was put in a psycho prison. And there are articles detailing scores, dozens of people whom the psychiatrists admitted were fully normal people that were placed in prison, and they were given drugs and therapies that destroyed their minds. And this is just one aspect of what is known as the Einstein terror. And that, I kind of resented that, so I began to look into Einstein's racism and the racism of the Jewish people going all the way back to the Old Testament. And I found that they were the strongest segregationists and the most racist people on earth. And that led me on into all different areas. I discovered that it was Jews who were actually behind the genocide of the Armenians, Jews that were behind Bolshevism, all of these horrible genocidal political movements that have caused humanity such pains. And it struck me as odd that they were so hypocritical as to call people who merely questioned Einstein anti-Semites, when many Jews themselves were such staunch segregationists and such vicious racists.
Remarkable, down the rabbit hole indeed. A lot of a lot of things to dig deeper into of what you just have mentioned there. But tell us a bit about your. I think the first book, at least on this, right, was Albert Einstein, the Incorrigible Plagiarist. I think it was released in 2002. Is that correct?
Yes, it was. And the chapter in that book which drew the most attention was a chapter I had on Mileva Einstein-Marity, in which I described the evidence that indicated that she had at least co-authored the 1905 papers that Einstein published on special relativity, Brownian motion, and the photoelectric effect, for which he eventually won the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect. And when he won that prize, he gave the winnings to Mileva, even though they had been divorced and had a very bitter relationship.
Interesting. So tell us a bit first about kind of, I guess, the myth really of Einstein, and why this guy has been lifted up in the way that he has. I mean, it's in terms of pop culture, this is the go-to image that we use for, like, you know, human progress and science and advancements and and all those wonderful things. How did he end up in that role, if you will?
Well, the beginning of the myth was started by him, by his failure to cite those whose work he had derived his work from, including Mileva, evidently. So that is how the myth evolved, that his work came spontaneously and was completely original. It then occurred to people that this could be built up and utilized to promote the Zionist movement, because Einstein had befriended people like Kurt Blumenthal and Georg Nikolai, and they realized that this scientific advancement, which was largely due to Henri Poincaré, could be utilized to bolster the Zionist movement and it would be very attractive to Jews. Now, Jews for centuries had suffered under the stigma that they were not very creative people and had never produced a genius. They were known from ancient times, and Josephus even complains about this, as the people of the book. And their religion forbid them from exploring science and philosophy. And the only significant philosopher they ever developed was Spinoza, and the only significant person in the arts at the time that Einstein emerged was Mendelssohn. So they were thought to be very mentally sterile, and they had been stagnant during the Renaissance. And when emancipation came about, Moses Mendelssohn said that the Jews should reform their religion to tolerate studies of philosophies, sciences, and the arts, and that it was not an affront to God to pursue those fields. For example, when my Maimonides came up with the 613 laws that contravened the 10 commandments of the Bible, he was almost excommunicated for it.
Mm-hmm.
But the Jews today believe that they have 613 laws. So they evolved out of the idea that they had no right to interpret laws or science. And they then wanted to promote the idea that Jews produced great geniuses in contradistinction to their entire history. So they promoted the idea that Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein were not only great geniuses, but the greatest geniuses that mankind had ever produced. And in my books, you'll find quotations from several Jews who felt obliged to do both of those things, to use Albert Einstein to promote Zionism, and to use Albert Einstein as an example of the fact that Jews could also produce not only great geniuses, but the greatest geniuses.
And obviously they, well, if I'm kind, let me say they lean heavily on other people's work. I think that's too kind. But, you know, like Marx, of course, very dependent on Friedrich Engels, etc. We had, you mentioned some of the people that Einstein was dependent on. Tell us a bit more about that. In what kind of environment that they managed to maybe work together with others or pick up other people's ideas, but then eventually kind of promote that as their own?
Well, with Freud, you had Freud plagiarizing the work of William James and the ancient Greeks, especially Plato. His tripartite, personality, and many other things came straight out of Plato. In terms of Einstein, the significant event that really promoted him was in 1919. They did some eclipse observations, and the Jewish press hyped those eclipse observations. And then when the results from those observations finally came in, they were said to confirm the general theory of relativity. And then the press in New York and in London really, really hyped Einstein and said that he was the new Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton. And that is what really made him a significant figure. But the scientists in Germany pointed out that his prediction of the eclipse had already been made by a German named Soldner back in, I think, 1804. And he predicted that the deflection of light in a gravitational field would be twice the effect that Newtonian gravitational theory predicted. And Einstein failed to cite Soldner's work, and it created quite a controversy in Germany. And there was a group of German scientists, including Nobel Prize laureate Philipp Lenard, who organized a collection of scientists to protest what was going on because they felt it was very harmful to science to make such a circus out of scientific thought. And they resented the idea that Einstein had not only plagiarized Soldner's work, but another scientist named Paul Gerber, who had predicted that gravitational forces would propagate at light speed, which became the basis of Einstein's theory that gravitational waves exist. And Einstein plagiarized not only Gerber's idea that gravity propagates at light speed, but his equation for the perihelion motion of the planet Mercury. He plagiarized it in its exact form, and he was brought to task for it. And what he did was call all of these people anti-Semites. And he was bashed so hard in Germany that he decided to leave Germany, and he wanted to make a visit to America. And in America, he was met with the New York Jews. There were many, many Jews from Eastern Europe who had emigrated to New York City. And he had a very big, splashy welcome in New York City. But even in America, many scientists, including Arvid Reuterdahl and Charles Lane Poore and TJJC, pointed out that Einstein was a plagiarist and that his theories were not very significant. For example, the eclipse observations changed absolutely nothing in people's daily lives. So they were at a loss to explain why they were being hyped so heavily, just as the gravitational wave theory today is being hyped so heavily, even though it's an insignificant thing. It changes absolutely nothing in our daily lives. And Einstein said, when Reuterdahl challenged him to a debate to both explore the fundamentals of the theory of relativity and the fact that he had plagiarized those fundamentals, Einstein refused, and he said that the only reason that he had come to America was to promote Zionism to American Jews. And there were many significant Zionists in America who stated that that was why Einstein had come, and that was why they invited them to come, including Justice Brandeis, who was a Frankish Jew on the US Supreme Court. And then Einstein was to be given the key to the city of New York, and an alderman protested it, an alderman named Faulkner, and they called him an anti-Semite. And a famous Zionist judge, Judge Mack, tried to destroy Faulkner and ruin his career. And it was a major scandal in New York City. And Einstein faced scandal after scandal after scandal. He had been asked about Edison in Boston, and he didn't know the answer to the questions, and that created a scandal. And when he arrived in New York City, there were massive parades for him and crowds of people. But when he left, there were only a few people on the dock, and he was a total embarrassment.
Very interesting. A number of things here that I haven't heard about before. I doubt our audience has either, of course, if they're not familiar with your work. But okay, so this political side is something I want to get into later, but let's stick to the science a little bit here as well. You mentioned a couple of people like Reuterdahl and Faulkner and these people. Now, did they write and publish material about this at the time, so that this is some of the material that you have access to see what they thought and how they deconstructed what Einstein brought to the table?
Yes, and you'll find much of that in my book, Albert Einstein, the Incorrigible Racist. I republish numerous articles that Reuterdahl authored and published in 1921 when Albert Einstein came to America. And one of them was published in, at that time, one of the largest newspapers in America called the Dearborn Independent, which was published by Henry Ford for the express purpose of exposing the fact that Jews were doing untoward things towards America and the world. And I think at that time, it had a circulation of over 750,000. They would give it away free at all of the Ford dealerships.
Interesting. Yeah. So, okay. Obviously, today we have a very polished, we'll get into, relativity theory and these kind of things in a moment too, but you have a very polished, I would assume, image of Einstein that's been given out today. It's been, cleansed from this kind of criticism. At least we are not exposed to it, although the fact that it's still there, you've been able to access it, you've been able to find this and dig this up in your research and work. But obviously then it means that this didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It was a guard behind Einstein that was very willing and able to promote him the way they did in the media, correct?
Yes, and the primary weapon that they used to silence people was to call them anti-Semitic. And bear in mind that this was long before World War II. The Jews had been calling people anti-Semitic to silence them going back all the way into the ancient world. Even in the Roman Empire, that was their main weapon of choice to silence their critics.
And did they use Semites explicitly as the term as well then?
Back then, no. Semites is a term that came about by Wilhelm Marr when he coined the term anti-Semite, but it related to language and not to race.
Right, yeah.
And that was, I think, in 1875 or 1877. And he responded to the banking crises that had happened in Vienna and Berlin where I think it was Black Wednesday or Black Friday, they had crashed the markets deliberately and then reaped enormous profits from it. And that was the beginning of the modern anti-Semitic movement in Europe. And he was himself of Jewish descent.
Let's talk a bit about the theory of relativity, the mass energy equivalence, the E equals mc squared 2 and all that stuff. Yeah, just deconstruct that a bit for us and talk about that in terms of how you view it today versus the version that we're getting of this in the popular science.
Well, in terms of priority, Jules-Henri Poincaré published a paper in 1900 discussing the momentum of an electron that would demonstrate that its mass was a product of its energy was a product of its mass times its velocity, and that is the basis for the formula E equals mc squared. And Einstein published a paper in 1905, which is taken as the mass energy equivalence formula, even though it didn't expressly state E equals mc squared either. And that has been promoted as one of Einstein's great achievements, but a man named Herbert Ives published several papers exposing the fact that Henri Poincaré had the formula first and that Einstein did not derive it in a logical way. His arguments were circular. He first proposed the equation and then used the equation to derive itself from itself. Now, in terms of the significance of that equation, Einstein failed to understand it, and he had absolutely nothing to do with the development of atomic energy or the atomic bomb, other than putting his signature to a letter to President Roosevelt, which began the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. But Robert Oppenheimer, who was the most significant scientist involved in that project, didn't want Einstein involved in it because he thought he was a lesser scientist. So those are the primary myths that circulate about E equals mc squared. Einstein was not the first to create the equation. He did not fully understand its significance, and he had absolutely nothing to do with the development of the atomic bomb.
Now, overall, do you have a problem with the way that the science has been, well, not promote that's the wrong word, but basically there's a lot of people that basically have looked at Einstein's work and said overall it's just wrong, right? That the conclusions are they're way out there. It's still just theories, but despite this, we have built our entire scientific establishment in certain respects upon some of his ideas and whatnot. Is the foundation flawed, in your opinion?
Yes, it is. The concept of space-time is a very flawed concept. It is a metaphysical concept which cannot be refuted by scientific means. It exists only in the mind as an abstraction, and they try to reify that abstraction as if it were something physical. And I think that is a fundamental problem. Another problem is that it is an absolutist theory and not a relativistic theory, in that it asserts that the velocity of light is absolute and all measurement has to be based upon that absolutist assumption. So it distorts science, which had traditionally based itself upon solid measurement, to measurement based upon assumption, which I think is a flawed concept. Another thing that I think is most problematic with it is the dismissal of the ether concept, the concept that space may contain some kind of fluid that transmits forces at a distance from one mass to another mass. And I think the loss of that conception has had horrific consequences for 20th century science. And many scientists, top scientists, for example, Friedwald Wienerberg from the University of Nevada at Reno, has come up with significant ether theories. And Anatoly Loganov, who passed away, I think, last year, was one of the top Russian physicists. And he had plasma theories that related to the ether that were very significant. But these ideas are not allowed to be discussed in physics journals because they are suppressed, because they contradict Einstein's declaration that there is no ether.
Very interesting. What points to the fact that that light is not a constant in terms of observation.
In terms of observation, the problem with the idea that light is not a constant is that you have to measure it as a two-way second-order effect. You cannot simply use measuring rods and set your clocks without utilizing light to set the clocks, and therefore to set the clocks you have to assume a speed for light. It's a circular argument.
Right.
Of course, if you assume that the speed of light is whatever it is you assume it to be, and you then use that assumption as the basis for synchronizing your clocks for measurements, you end up with the result as a foregone conclusion and not as an actual measurement.
Yeah, we're in the laboratory environment and trying to suggest that we're outside of it, right? And have an objective view on the world when we're in fact within the confines of it, right?
Yes, and we are defining space and time based upon an assumption instead of a measurement.
We've had actually some news here in the last couple of days come out in terms of gravitational waves and all that stuff, right? There was a couple of stories that came out quite a few stories actually. Was a bombardment in terms of the scientific press and all that stuff of how a billion-year-old event proves Einstein's theory correct. The discovery of gravitational waves shows why funding for basic research is so vital, blah, blah, blah. They talked about how, this particular gravitational waves validates his theory or whatnot. Have you been keeping up with the latest, and what would you say about all of that?
I've seen it. I haven't looked at the data. I haven't had time to dig into it too deeply. But what I would say about it is that the significant idea is that if gravitation can propagate as waves, it means it has a finite velocity. And the significant scientist behind that hypothesis is Paul Gerber, not Albert Einstein. And the propagation of waves in gravitational fields has absolutely nothing to do with the abstract concept of space-time. If it is a physical reality that is being measured, it cannot be measured in space-time because there are no laboratories in space-time. So they are misrepresenting their findings as if it is proof of some abstraction, which it is not. Even if the findings are correct and their interpretations are correct, their fundamental assumptions of what it is that they are measuring are pseudoscience, metaphysics.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and as I said, I think they've built so much on this, and so much of the science overall now. If it's built on a flawed assumption to begin with, we're basically out on a tangent, out on a branch of the scientific tree, trying to fund projects and things that is there to validate that very basic theory, right? It's a very it's a very wasteful thing overall in terms of how much money is being spent on this. But is there any, as far as you're concerned, any room for contradictory theories within the official scientific and academic world that contradicts this?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is the most significant problem with what's going on, is that they are creating a dogma and they refuse to publish any work which would refute that dogma. They simply refuse to even consider it. It's a policy of the major physics journals that the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics are fundamental theories, and therefore anything which questions them or would refute them or even would provide an alternative to them cannot be considered for publication. And there are scientists who have alternative theories, and they are frequently called anti-Semitic for submitting those theories. Or they are browbeaten, and it is claimed that they don't understand the theory of relativity, because if they did understand it, they would know that there cannot be any other theory.
Interesting. Now, let's analyze a bit what you think the intention is here. Do you think that we're simply dealing with a situation where the majority actually are? I guess we can break it up in terms of who we're talking about here. But on one hand, we have the scientific establishment, we have the media, and we have the Jewish lobby, the Jewish establishment behind the promotion of someone like Einstein, for example. Do you think that the goal is are they more eager to push someone like Einstein because it's one of theirs, right? So they want to validate those theories, or do you think we're talking about a situation where they intentionally are taking us in a different direction scientifically, meaning they think or they know it's not correct, but at this stage they're not going to go in a different direction and assume that this was wrong, or they're not going to backtrack basically because they want to take us in that direction? It's a big question, I know, but what's your thoughts on that?
Well, what's happening is not unprecedented. Aristotle, for many centuries, was considered a major authority, and it was literally a crime to question what he had established as his scientific theories. And then Galileo was attacked for questioning the theories of Aristotle. And then Galileo became kind of a dogma, and Rene Descartes became sort of a dogma. And then Isaac Newton became a very strong dogma. And Einstein is supposedly given credit for breaking down the dogmatic status of Isaac Newton. So this is not unprecedented. Quite the contrary, this is the normal process of science, because students become indoctrinated into these beliefs as if they are established fact, rather than as if they are simply consistent with all available data and therefore the best theory that we have at present. The scientific method is rejected in favor of hero worship. Now, what has generated that hero worship goes far beyond what has happened in the past. And what has generated that hero worship is the fact that the Jews refuse to give Einstein's predecessors credit for their work, and they are promoting Einstein as an icon to be worshipped, as if what he said was so unfathomable to those not initiated into the priesthood that they should not even bother to try to understand not only it, but the consequences of it. And that began right away with those eclipse observations when they announced that only 12 people in the world could understand them. So what they are doing is creating divine mysteries which prevent people from pursuing other ideas. Their motives for doing that are many. And yes, I think part of their motives are political. Now, you're implying that they are deliberately leading us down a false path. And the reasons why they may be doing that are because they have technologies which they wish to keep to themselves. And there are many technologies being advanced in Israel and in laboratories which are under the control of the Jews. But I have no evidence that they are suppressing better theories than Einstein's theories deliberately and foisting Einstein's theories upon us in order to keep us primitive and backwards. But it's interesting to note that the protocols of the learned elders of Zion said that what you're implying would take place. And I think they gave Darwinism as an example in the protocols, that they would come out with new scientific theories to mystify people and keep them in a primitive, unscientific state. Now, that's what happened, but whether or not that is the motive for what happened, I cannot say. And I don't really believe it. I don't really believe that they're trying to prevent us from arriving at the truth or from arriving at scientific discoveries which would advance us to the point where we could defend ourselves from the Jews.
Well, I think it's usual.
But they did do that to the Germans. They did try to prevent the Germans from developing nuclear weapons. And then when we had developed the A-bomb in America, it was Jewish spies who gave that technology to the Soviets, which has hurt us ever since.
Oh, exactly. That's a really important point, by the way. I'm making note of that here so we can return to that. But yeah, I was going to say, I think as usual, you have many different objectives and agendas, going at the same time, probably even within the group, right? This is just the nature of how things work. It's never going to be the one objective that everyone pushes for. Highly unlikely, in my opinion, in a way.
And the situation is dynamic. There are always new things which come up, which force them into different directions, unanticipated things, or simply contingencies that they have to deal with as the situation evolves.
Do you think that the National Socialists managed to, at least for a time, kind of detach themselves from that scientific establishment that led them to some other interesting? I mean, I know there's some researchers that done tremendous amounts of work on this, which kind of suggests uh, the acquisition or the stealing, the taking of, for example, patents and research and stuff like that after the war, both by the U.S. but also by the Soviets. But do you think that they managed to develop some things which lie outside of this particular theory, which garnered them an advantage, if you will, if you see what I'm saying?
Yes, that's a fantastic question, and I'm afraid I'm the wrong person to ask because I don't have a great knowledge of it. But there was that same Philip Leonard, who was a Nobel Prize laureate, tried to eliminate what he called Jewish physics from German physics. And he was a staunch believer in the ether theory, and he had a meta-ether theory that relied upon an Ur-ether. And I think that, yes, that did lead to wonderful scientific advances because it freed people up from a dogma that was dealing only with mathematics to a scientific approach toward resolving physical problems. And I think there was a great, almost the rising of a phoenix in German science when they broke free of Jewish domination and allowed a non-Asiatic mental approach to science to take over. The Asiatics have always had a more metaphysical and supernatural approach to science and things and to laws as being God-derived. And Europeans have always had a more scientific, physical approach to it. And I think in unburdening the minds of German physicists from all of that metaphysical delusion, that it did inspire the genesis of many wonderful things. But I'm the wrong person to ask to specify what those were and how they evolved because I haven't researched that.
Yeah, very interesting though. Just the concept of moving away from a more theoretical and some of these mathematical labyrinths that seems to be largely detect from observable reality in some cases. And there's, again, we're running with assumptions, and you can, I mean, to a certain extent, it's been said before, but you can prove almost anything with the right numbers and with the right equations, right? And
with the right number of dimensions, you create freedom of motion, which has led to the absurdity of string theory, where whenever they run into a dead end in trying to describe physical events, they simply add another dimension to their theory to provide freedom of movement to account for it as if it's happening by way of geometry instead of by way of forces and an ether. And it's a dead end. It just gets more and more ridiculous.
Well, exactly. And again, look at the immense costs that are involved in taking things in this direction, looking for, the God particle or the Higgs boson, for example, the Hadron Collider. You have the CERN, equivalent on the border between Switzerland and France, the largest scientific experiment in as far as we know, in human history. Tremendous amounts of money on this. Is that a dead end in your view?
I think that there will be new discoveries when we start to shatter things into smaller and smaller pieces, but the way that those discoveries are interpreted are very significant. And we have to allow for dissenting voices to express alternative views as to what's happening and how it ought to be described mathematically and physically. So I'm not opposed to those experiments, but I do think that there are ways that money has to be spent simply to preserve the human race from these technologies themselves, and that we have to also focus on how nature has preserved itself for millions of years and how we are interfering with those natural processes and corrupting them in ways which will eventually destroy us. And another point I wanted to make about the Germans freeing themselves from Jewish physics was that there is a parallel in the way that the Germans freed themselves from Jewish economics and Jewish monetary policies.
Oh, yeah.
And they deliberately took themselves off of the gold standard and started to issue their own currency, which was debt-free, that enabled them to grow economically. So not only was there a blossoming of scientific research when they freed themselves, there was an economic blossoming in the early 1930s to the mid-1930s that was really wonderful and needs to be studied so that we can replicate it in America and in Europe, because we are in a horrific, at the edge of an economic precipice where our monetary systems are about to collapse. And I think the National Socialists, initially with a man named Gottfried Feder, and then with Hjalmar Schacht, came up with ways of resolving these economic crises in ways that were beneficial to everyone in society and not simply to those who were usurers and who were trying to exploit society for economic gain.
Very important point. Absolutely. I mean, imagine what we could do there if we were freed up from that environment, you know?
And the two forces worked together very, very well in Germany.
Mhm.
The revival of their economic strength promoted the revival of their scientific strength.
Which
And
led to remarkable discoveries and an advancement which is probably unprecedented in human history, I'd say.
I would agree. Absolutely.
Very important. What else do you think we should know? I don't know if we talked that much in detail about it, but let's go back to that one of the famous papers, a manuscript from 1905, that was including his first paper on special relativity, and it was signed then by his at the time first wife. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, when Einstein passed away in 1955, a famous Russian Jewish physicist named Abram Yoffe published a sort of a biographical obituary of Einstein in the Ushpeki Fizikitsky, or whatever it is in Russian, the most famous Russian physics journal. And he titled it "In Remembrance of Albert Einstein." And whenever he was discussing Einstein, he always referred to him simply as Einstein. But there's a very significant paragraph in that obituary where he states that the author of the three papers of 1905 was Einstein-Marity. And then he tries to explain that away by saying that that was Albert Einstein's married name, which he had adopted by Swiss custom. But then if you look into other writings that Yoffe had, he stated that he went to try to visit Albert Einstein in Zurich in Switzerland. And when he went, he met Mileva Einstein-Marity at their home. And she told him that Albert Einstein wasn't at home and that by his own admission, he had no serious thoughts about science or about experiments. And Yoffe specifically stated that the author of the papers was Einstein-Marity. Now, Mileva Einstein-Marity did go by the name Einstein-Marity, and it appears on her headstone, and it appears in several other places. Now, Joffe's friend, Daniel Danin, clarified what Yoffe had stated, and Danin, in writing about Einstein, said that the papers were signed Einstein-Marity. And there was a Serbian physicist named Desanka Trubovic-Guric who took note of all these facts. And she published either a book or an article in about 1969 where she exposed all of these facts and argued for the idea that Mileva Einstein-Marity had either been the sole author of the paper or had been the co-author of the paper. And the next, she had that work translated into German, I think, in 1983. And then the next significant event in the history of that story came about in the late 1980s or early 1990s when the Collected Papers Project began to publish the correspondence that Albert Einstein had sent to Mileva Einstein-Marity. They weren't married yet at that time, but sent to Mileva marriage. And in that correspondence, he frequently made note of the fact that they were collaborating on their scientific work, and specifically said that he looked forward to the day when their work on the theory of relative motion had become victorious. And a physicist in America named Evan Harris Walker published an article in a physics journal exposing that fact and claiming that Mileva Einstein-Marity was Albert Einstein's collaborator and had collaborated on the work of 1905. And then I put that together with some of my findings that Einstein's first biographer, Alexander Moskovsky, who helped promote Einstein and said that he wanted to create a cult around Einstein, so that he could be used to promote various things, including Zionism. That Alexander Moskovsky had pointed out that Mileva Maric was Einstein's scientific collaborator.
Hmm.
So all of that evidence together puts together the idea that she either wrote the papers or she worked on the papers. And there are many other issues which arise, including the fact that he gave her all of the Nobel Prize winnings, even though it was against his nature to do so.
Interesting. And what more do you think we should know about her and her role in this, in terms of her? Is there other material that suggests that she was, brilliant in that regard and inspired him in many ways, and ultimately, led him to to steal her ideas?
Yes, her son said that she used to coach Albert Einstein on mathematics, and I think there's a paper that bears her notes correcting his mistakes on his papers. And their correspondence also evinces the fact that they were submitting papers together, and that she was working together with him in these ways and was pursuing the same literature that he was pursuing, that they would ultimately plagiarize and incorporate into their papers. And there are numerous statements from Einstein and his friends that Einstein was not very good at turning his theoretical ideas into formal mathematical theories. And he stated over and over again, and his friends stated over and over again, that he always relied upon collaborators to do all that work for him, but he only very rarely would give them credit. And then you add on to all of that the fact that the papers are thoroughly unoriginal and copy the work of their predecessors almost verbatim. And it adds up to the idea that Einstein had that kind of a personality, where he would assume credit for what other people had done and would stubbornly refuse to give them credit. And another significant idea is the fact that after his divorce from Mileva in 1919, he never created anything overly significant.
Oh yeah, really?
Really, yes, absolutely. And even in the development, he split from her in 1914, and I think the laws obliged them to wait out a 5-year period before becoming officially divorced. But the general theory of relativity had its roots prior to 1914, and the theory itself relied upon equations that David Hilbert derived that Einstein plagiarized. And it also relied upon the work of his friend Marcel Grossman, whom he never gave adequate credit. And Grossman always was very hurt by the fact that Albert Einstein never gave him full credit for what he had contributed. And there was another man named Freundlich, and of course Paul Gerber created the perihelion equations of general relativity, and the idea that gravitational effects propagate at light speed. So the full foundation, and it also goes back to Riemannian geometry, the full foundation of the general theory of relativity came not from Einstein, but from others, and he never gave them adequate credit for it.
Yeah, there was a lot of brilliant people from Serbia around at that time. Of course, Tesla being being one of them too. But here points to Mileva Maric as well. Then, do you think then that
And Tesla rejected Einstein.
Right, exactly, yeah.
The reason he rejected Einstein was what we discussed earlier, the fact that Einstein was trying to prevent scientists from exploring the hypothesis of an ether. And Tesla pointed out that Einstein and physics in general were venturing off into a land of mathematical fantasy, and that the real truth and the real ability to think scientifically, to create discoveries and inventions, lied in pursuing the notion that space contains a fluid called the ether. And Tesla was a huge advocate of pursuing ether theories, and all of his research and discoveries and inventions are based upon his pursuit of ether theories, which shows that when human beings explore physical reality in a physical sense, a sense that can literally be perceived by the senses instead of abstract mathematics, they are far more likely to create inventions that are physically real than they are when they simply pursue more and more hyperspace dimensions to try to explain things away that they can't explain with their theories.
Yeah, I guess a little bit of a different topic here, but I guess maybe if a feminist would say that the reason why she wasn't recognized is because the environment, whatever at the time, didn't allow for women to be part of science or these kinds of discoveries. But do you think that would be a false premise, considering that she was, of course, admitted to Heidelberg University? She studied there. There was a it doesn't seem to be such a repressive climate at the time. To be honest, it seems quite open for women too, right?
I don't think so. And I think Leonard was from Heidelberg. She knew Philip Leonard. Um, I think that she and Marie Curie are the exceptions that prove the rule. I do think women were discriminated against that way. And there were female authors who would publish under male names, including the Zionist George Eliot, simply because women were so discriminated against in that era. And being a woman, she also faced burdens that he didn't face, including bearing their first child named Lieserl, who disappeared from the record shortly after she was born. She had a child in 1902, and Albert did not support her and abandoned her
Really?
abandoned her during her pregnancy.
Hmm. Well, big surprise. Seems to be the case with a lot of these guys.
So there were numerous obstacles, and I think the feminists are correct to point out that that would be a likely reason, both that she would suffer the insecurities of not wanting her name to appear in print ultimately, and she seemed to be a terribly insecure person in many ways, and also the likelihood that the German publication, Annalen der Physik, which had an editor named Drude, would want a German male name in print as the author. I think those are significant, substantial, and legitimate points that feminists have made.
So, do you think that this suggests that she was an agreeable silent partner to this? That she agreed to a certain extent to let Einie take the credit for this, or what? What do you think her perception of all of this was at the time?
Well, she explicitly stated to one of her friends that she was hoping that her husband would become world famous based upon their work, that she had submitted a paper with him which would make her husband world famous, I think is what she said. So I think, yes, she thought that her chances of success and of obtaining economic success would be greater by allowing him to put forward the work as if he had done it.
Yeah.
Or at least that's the way it resolved itself. Again, Joffe and Danin said that the papers were signed, Einstein-Marity, in the original handwritten manuscripts. And it is likely that Joffe would have seen them because he was a student under Röntgen. And Röntgen, who came up with the cathode rays, was on the staff of Annalen der Physik, and he reviewed papers for editorial purposes, and he was pursuing Lorentz's theory, from whom the Einsteins plagiarized the Lorentz equation and the contraction hypothesis, that things in motion contract in their length. And he had questioned Joffe about that. And Joffe, when he gave his dissertation for his doctoral thesis, was questioned about Lorentz's theories. So we know that both those men, prior to the publication of Einstein's paper, were pursuing the same thing which people now claim appeared in Einstein's paper for the first time. So they were both familiar with those ideas and would have had an interest in looking at Einstein's paper. And for him to 50 years later state that the papers were signed Einstein-Marity, I think is very significant. It had to have stuck in his consciousness all of those years, and he made a point of bringing it out when Einstein died. And I think it's also significant to go back to that idea of the Einstein terror, that physicists were terrorized to never speak out against Einstein. And this had taken place in the 1920s when the physicists organized in Germany to expose Einstein as a plagiarist and a fraud. Mm-hmm. They were viciously attacked in the international press as anti-Semites, even though they had said absolutely nothing anti-Semitic. And I can't remember if he was Croatian or Serbian, a physicist named Stepan Maharovičić his life had been threatened. And he was a famous physicist. And his life was threatened simply for pointing out that Poincaré had come up with special relativity before Einstein. And a number of events took place to suppress scientists from ever exposing facts about Einstein. There was a Jewish philosopher named Oscar Krauss, and the Czech government prevented him from traveling to Germany by refusing to issue him a visa when these scientists in Germany met at the Berlin Philharmonic to expose Einstein as a plagiarist and a fraud. So even governments got involved in terrorizing people and suppressing their freedom of expression so that they could not raise public awareness of these facts. And in the Soviet Union, if you expose these facts, they would put you in psycho prisons and destroy your brain with drug therapies.
Ugh.
And this is a documented fact. I've read in Soviet journals from 68 and I think 74, where Jewish psychiatrists were bragging about the fact that they had taken dozens of people they describe as completely normal people with university educations and placed them in psycho prisons because they dared to question the theory of relativity, and they dubbed them paranoiacs. And this was standard procedure in the Soviet Union for anyone who dissented from what it was that the Bolshevik Jews wanted to impose on their culture and their educational system. If you questioned Soviet politics, they would do exactly the same thing to you. They would put you in a psycho prison and destroy your mind. And there was a famous physicist named Yuri Bravko who exposed all of this. And I hope that he hears what we're saying today, and I hope he's still alive, because he had a difficult time remembering all the tortures and abuse that he had suffered in a Soviet psycho prison for exposing the fact that Albert Einstein was a plagiarist.
Yeah, it's amazing how much material there is, though. As soon as you begin to scratch the surface a little bit and get beneath, well, obviously you've done more than scratching the surface, but in terms of, the cover-ups, the management of the man and the myth, and how much surrounding work it takes to keep this in place, and also, of course, and how much discontent at the time there actually was to all of this. Obviously, the big giveaway would be: are these papers with her and Einstein's name on it available? Have they been, are they gone, or do you know where those are?
No, no one does. They are presumed to be lost forever and have been destroyed, which is very interesting. Why were they destroyed? And the reason that I brought that up about the Soviet psycho prisons is because I think it's important to understand why Joffe wouldn't come out more strongly exposing Albert Einstein.
Right. Yeah.
And Joffe was also a very early communist who left Germany during the revolution in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, to join the other Bolshevik Jews there. So he felt a tribal loyalty to Einstein and probably didn't want to expose it more fully for that reason. But he gave us some very strong clues. And his friend, Danin, pointed out specifically that the papers were signed Einstein-Marity.
Yeah, very interesting.
And the correspondence from Mileva returning Albert's correspondence has largely been destroyed. And that's another very interesting fact. And when the Collected Papers project began, there were several lawyers for Einstein's estate, and there were other people involved who wanted much of the correspondence to be suppressed. Anything that cast Einstein in a negative light. I don't know if it was lawyers for the estate or not, but there were people involved who wanted those things suppressed, which is very indicative of the idea, your words are, cover-up was taking place. But I think we could fairly say the preservation of his image has led to the suppression of many facts that portray him in a very different light from the cartoonistic image that the press has created of him.
Absolutely. Well, obviously, he went on to marry his cousin later, Elsa. So nothing is known then of what happened to his first child with Maria?
With Mileva, no.
Mileva, sorry.
It was a little bit is known from their correspondence that she had a daughter. The daughter was named Lieserl, and it disappeared. I think that the child was born in 1902 and disappeared. And some speculate that it died of scarlet fever. Others speculate that it was given up for adoption. But he was very callous and had no concern at all, really, and abandoned her, just as he abandoned her after the divorce. and they had two sons, one of whom developed schizophrenia at age 20, which is a common thing among the children of Ashkenazi Jews, that around age 20 they develop schizophrenia. And she suffered miserably taking care of him to the very end of her life with very little support from Albert Einstein. And after she died, he went into asylums, and Albert did nothing to support him.
Oh boy. Wow. Well, I guess, the closing thought for the first segment here, and obviously I have much more to ask you about in the second. I think I want to go into the politics a bit more, in terms of how Einstein was beneficial to that, and we can go deep into the Zionist aspect and what was happening at the time. But one thing I wanted to mention, to you and to our audience, is this idea as well that in popular culture, even in, of course, science, it's almost a kind of an archetype has now developed around Einstein. The way he looks, the attitudes, it's like, it might seem silly, but I've paid attention to how many times, for example, referenced this is in movies and TV shows, and it's there as a kind of constant enforcement, so we know what the score is. And it might seem silly initially to just look at it from that level, but I think that has been tremendously beneficial in helping to kind of instill and enforce this image in people's minds, right? Of observing things in the popular culture and in the media. So when you do come out and speak out against it, it's very difficult, I think, for people to actually break free of that. It's almost like people have been subconsciously programmed with this love for Einstein. Have you gotten a lot of resistance and flack for your work?
Yes, and you're describing a process of brainwashing, and I have a good example of it. H.G. Wells in 1894 or 1895 published a book called The Time Machine. And the characters in that story discuss time as a fourth dimension, and that you could move backwards and forwards in time the same way that you move backwards and forwards in space. And there was a movie made out of that book, which had been published long before the special theory of relativity. And in the movie that was made in whenever it was, the 1960s, they made no mention of Albert Einstein. But then they did a remake of the movie, and they introduced, I think, Einstein's ghost or something going back in time and talking to H.G. Wells. So they were even trying to give Einstein credit for what H.G. Wells had written 10 years before him.
Jeez.
I mean, it's the height of, it's so offensive to the people who had actually created these ideas. And that itself reveals the fact that they are only concerned with promoting Einstein and Jews and not the ideas themselves. Because when you detach the ideas from Einstein and point out who were the original figures who conceived of these ideas initially, people are no longer interested. They're only interested in those ideas when they're associated with Einstein. And if you detach that godlike figure from the ideas, they're no longer concerned about them, which reveals exactly what you were expressing, that they have been brainwashed to become awestruck whenever his name is mentioned.
Yeah.
And it's not because they find the ideas so very intriguing, rather they find the character, or have been brainwashed to find the character so intriguing.
Yeah, as a cult of personality, as always, right?
Absolutely. And his friend Alexander Moskovsky said, I think 1917, that he was corresponding with Einstein, and he said that his primary objective in life was to build up this cult around Einstein.
Very interesting. Now, we'll talk about the books here in a moment, but we hear often that the very fundamental foundation of Western civilization as it stands today, and the progress of it materially, theoretically, and everything else, is something that has worked together with so many genius of the Jewish persuasion, right? That if we look at the balance sheet, then they're far outrepresented in terms of their ideas and what they have contributed, etc. There's a lot to say about that, of course, but just in general, somewhat brief, what would you say to that and about that?
Well, that can be taken both positively and negatively, and they have had a tremendous impact on Western civilization, especially through a Jew named Jesus.
Right.
And Christianity was terribly destructive to European culture and brought about the end of the glory of the ancient period. And it wasn't until the Renaissance, when they rejected Jewish dogmatism and returned to the greatness of the European ancients, that they began to grow and pull out of the Dark Ages. So it's a double-edged sword. I think it's true that Jews have had a tremendously significant impact on Western civilization, but it's been a negative impact, not a positive impact.
Interesting.
And they try to portray it as if it's a positive impact. Well, look at the impact that Karl Marx had on Western civilization.
I know. Horrible. The mass murder that's at the end of this, it's just
100 million souls lost because of it.
God, it's utterly it's extraordinary. It's absolutely amazing. Well, you know what? Let's pick up and talk more about this in the second segment. We have much more to talk about here. That's already a lot to chew on. Fascinating stuff that you've talked with us here about. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the books and about the website where you write about this. You had, I think it was back in, let me see here, I'll look at the Amazon page again. Yeah, so it was back in 2002 and 3 that you released a lot of this material, and then it was, quiet on the book front from you for a very long time, and then you came out, boom, with what, 5 books. Is that what you did in the intermediate period there, and when it was somewhat quiet, or a lot of research?
What you're referring to are books that I've actually put into print. And recently they took down my blog, so I decided to put a lot of the material which I had up since 2005, 2006 as freely available PDF files. And I updated them and then put them into print because I realized how ephemeral the internet is, and that if I wasn't careful, all of my material would be lost and be suppressed. So I decided to go ahead and put it into hard copy form.
Very good. Now tell us about the books. Give us the titles, and of course where people can go to pick up more. There's a lot to read up on here. Where would you recommend people if they're just getting started and getting into this?
If they are interested in the history of the special theory of relativity, I have a new book called Space-Time Theories Before Einstein. And in that book, I have a couple of chapters to introduce it where I break down every significant element of the special theory of relativity and quote the prior works of others where those ideas were derived from. And then in the rest of the book, I republish the full papers of Poincaré, Lorentz, and many, many others where they were giving space-time theories and the special theory of relativity before Einstein, including Voigt and Larmor, who were very significant. Voigt had the Lorentz transformation within a scale factor, I think in 1887, and I republished his full paper, and many, many others. There were many people saying that space and time form a four-dimensional manifold long before the space-time theory of the special theory of relativity. And it's interesting to note that Einstein initially rejected Poincaré and Minkowski's idea of space-time. And he published a couple of papers, I think in 1907 or 1908, dismissing the idea of space-time. And it wasn't until he realized that he could utilize it in a gravitational theory that he adopted it much later, I think 1911 or 1912. Other books that I have up is Mileva Einstein-Marity, Einstein's Partner in Crime, and people can find that also on Amazon. And that gives a full breakdown of all the facts which evince that Mileva Einstein-Marity was Einstein's partner in his scientific studies. And I also have a second part of the book that addresses all of the issues relative to Einstein's Nobel Prize. And Swedes would especially find this interesting.
Yep.
Because there was a Swedish professor from Stockholm, Oscar Weston, and he published an article in a large Swedish newspaper, Nya Dagligt Allehanda.
Oh yeah, Nya Dagliga Allehanda, yes.
Thank you. That's what happens to my name too.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
On 22 October 1922, in which he called Einstein a plagiarist and said that he should not be given the Nobel Prize. And he outlined who it was that Einstein plagiarized, the flaws in his theory, and the fact that the general scientific community had rejected Einstein. And I republished that full article in the original Swedish in my book.
Oh, awesome. That would be a lot of fun to see that, actually. That would be great. Yeah.
Well, I'll send you a PDF of it. Maybe you could translate it someday.
Exactly. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
And then I have a book, The Jewish Genocide of Armenian Christians, which generated tremendous controversy when I first released the first edition in 2006. And then I went to Glendale, California, where they have a large Armenian population. And I gave a conference lecture on the subject. And that book details the fact that the so-called Young Turks were actually Jews who wanted to destroy the Ottoman Empire so that they could take Palestine and fulfill the Zionist quest to take Palestine and make it a national homeland for the Jews. And discussing Einstein's racism, I have a book, Albert Einstein, The Incorrigible Racist, which is also available on Amazon. And I have a book called Racial Zionism, which is a source book that republishes all of the significant Zionist writings where they created the modern concept of racial Zionism, including Mordecai Emanuel Noah, Moses Hess, Leon Pinsker, Theodore Herzl, Israel Songville, Ignat Solzhan, and Louis Dembitz Brandeis.
Wow, fascinating. Well, I mean, there's a lot for people here to dive into, years and years of work and research, and we're going to have the links up to all these books on our program page for this program, ladies and gentlemen. So go there and find all the links, or just go to Amazon and, of course, search for Christopher Jon Bjerknes, and you'll find the links to this, of course. But yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I'd love to talk more about the political side to Einstein here in the next segment, and we'll see if we can squeeze something in terms of the Armenian Genocide as well. That's a huge topic, of course, but we'll see what we can do. What's your you have a blog as well? Give us the website for that.
The blog is Jewish Racism as one word, jewishlacism.blogspot.com.
All right, very good. All right, well, thank you so much, Christopher. Stay with us. We'll take a short break, and then we'll be right back with more.
From my heart and from my hand, why don't people understand my intention?
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us here in the second segment. We are speaking with Christopher Jon Bjerknes about the myth of Einstein and his, theoretical trap, the people who have helped to create this, from the media to the establishment to the scientific and academic establishment as well. There's a whole lot that we've gone through here now. Absolutely fascinating. It's very interesting to hear about this. And where I'd like to begin now in the second segment here, Christopher, is really to talk more about Einstein's political aspirations, how he was instrumental in aiding the Zionist objective, and in terms of how him as being launched onto the scene helped to kind of propel the movement. Tell us a bit about his, I guess, personal opinions, as far as you know, when it came to Zionism.
Well, he was caught up in the turmoil of the First World War. And one of the reasons why we had a First World War was to break apart the Ottoman Empire and free up Palestine for Jewish occupation. Another was to break apart the empires which existed in Europe and to fuse them all into a pan-European empire, and to create perpetual wars among these empires. And Einstein was born into and was initially a citizen of the German Empire. And in the middle of World War I, he was very treasonous to the German people. And in his correspondence, he talked about how he hated the Germans and hoped that they would lose the war. And he spoke in his correspondence of the quote unquote horrid Europeans, and how the world could only be improved if Europeans were replaced by Chinese. And Einstein, it's true, it's horrific, it's true, and it reflects, since Einstein was a habitual plagiarist, and since Einstein's ideas were formulated by others, it reflects the fact that he was talking to very powerful Jews who told him that this would be the future. And one of the Jews who was his strong political mentor in formulating his Zionist and Bolshevist aspirations was a man named Georg Nikolai, whose original name was Levenstein. And Georg Nikolai was also a traitor against the German Empire in the midst of the war. And he wrote a book called The Biology of War. And he wrote that to try to weaken the Germans' will to fight. And he said quite correctly that modern warfare was weakening the genetics of modern European people by sending soldiers off to fight in the flower of their youth, and that the best, the strongest, and the bravest were being slaughtered by modern technology. And that in ancient warfare, it was a conquest of survival of the fittest, but that technology had reached a point where mass destruction was being perpetrated on whole peoples, and that it was destroying the best people and not producing a natural selection of the fittest, but of the worst. And in that book, he stated that the European race was inferior to the Chinese and Mongoloid race. And therefore, the Chinese and the Mongoloid race have the moral justification and the logical imperative to exterminate the European race. And when you put that idea together with the idea that Einstein was endorsing those ideas, it's very clear that the Jews want to exterminate the European race. And we know that from a future work by a man named Richard Coudenhove Kalergi, who is the father of the European Union and who was funded by the Jewish bankers Rothschild and Warburg. Now, this man wrote a book called Praktischer Idealismus in 1925, in which he stated that the Jews are a master race and that the Jews can only assume the throne of rule over the world by weakening the European race, and that the means to weakening the European race would be to dissolve all the European nations, destroy all their cultural heritage and their national traditions, and replace that with the European Union, and then to invite in Africans, Middle Easterners, and Asians to dilute the blood of Europeans through miscegenation to the point where they became a degenerate mixed race. And then at that point, these people would no longer have any sense of nationhood, and the ancient Jewish messianic prophecies of world rule out of Jerusalem, with Jews maintaining their nationhood and their national status and greatly increasing its influence, while concurrently destroying the national status and national influence of every other nation on earth, it would fulfill the Jewish messianic prophecies that the Jews could then rule the world and right the wrongs that history had perpetrated against the Jews. And this was completely in line with what Nikolai had written in 1917 and has manifested itself recently with the invasion of immigrants from Africa, from the Middle East, and from Asia into Europe, America, and Australia. And they are deliberately setting about to genocide the white race and destroy all sense of nationhood and of national heritage and national culture in each of our nations.
You know, we've brought up Count Richard Nicholas Coudenhove Kalergi, quite a few times on the program. It's definitely one of these very interesting and bizarre characters, both in terms of his wickedness, but also in terms of his dedication, which I find somewhat odd, to be honest. As far as we know, he was not Jewish himself. He did have
he was mixed race. He was part Japanese and part Dutch, I think.
Exactly. I wonder if that was at the root of it or something, or why he, because obviously, as you said, in his book Practical Idealism and in some of his other writings as well, he talked about the moral superiority, right, of the Jewish people as a kind of a, he called it Europe's spiritual leader race, I believe. Führerrasse or something was the word he used. And it's quite interesting that why he went down this road. I've been trying to find some more information about his drives and his motivations, and it's true as what you said, that he he was behind what's called a pan-European movement. It was largely set up together with Otto von Habsburg at the time. And it was, as you said, of course, it was funded by Warburgs and Rothschilds and everything else. But he managed to, propose the symbol of Europe, the anthem, and all these kinds of things together with Otto von Habsburg. And those things are actually things that have come into fruition. They even have something called the Coudenhove-Kalergi prize today that actually is awarded to a lot of the European politicians.
I was just going to mention that in the European Union itself, he is celebrated as the founder of the European Union. And Nick Griffin gave a speech in which he brought out the fact that this man proposed the idea of genociding the white race, and that is the purpose of the European Union, and it is taking place. And Griffin was booed down and called a racist when he just simply pointed out the facts.
Yeah, I read the quote by the man. It's remarkable. Let me actually read. I mean, I think many of our audience here will be aware of it, but let me read it again so you guys can hear what he actually said. It's important. So again, this is in the English translation of Practical Idealism. It says, "The man of the future will be a mongrel. Today's races and classes will disappear owing to the disappearance of space, time, and prejudice. The Eurasian Negroid race of the future, similar in its outward appearance to the ancient Egyptians, will replace the diversity of peoples with a diversity of individuals." Do you think it's his own maybe confused state, for the lack of a better word, that is at the driving force behind this? Or why did he team up, if you will, with other people that shared his common goal on this?
I think that he admired Jews and he was caught up among Jews, and Jews were discussing all of these things, and it became the center of his consciousness. He was influenced by them. That's what it is. And what he's describing is what is described in the Old Testament, undoing the work of the Tower of Babel and destroying all of the nations so that they can then be judged in Jerusalem by the Jewish king and be exterminated. The Jews believe that non-Jews have the seed of the devil in their genetic structure, which was imparted by the serpent in the Garden of Eden into Eve. And this is told in the Talmud and in the Kabbalah. And that the reason why the world is so dysfunctional and so evil is because Gentiles exist and carry with them this seed of evil. And that the only way to undo this evil is to eliminate the Gentiles. And the Old Testament has numerous passages in which it states that the Jews will rule over and destroy all of the nations while preserving their own nation, and that they will rule the world from Jerusalem in a period of peace. And a lot of people get sucked into this. Isaac Newton was another person who, long before Coudenhove-Kalergi, said that the Jews should destroy Europeans, essentially exterminate the white race in fire and flame, so that the Jews can then assume their natural throne over the earth and bring God back to the earth. Isaac Newton was a Zionist who proposed the very same idea of destroying Europeans that Coudenhove-Kalergi would. And Isaac Newton was one of countless pseudo-Christian Kabbalists, highly influential people who published these very same things, which eventually produced the Christian Zionist movement in America, where Christian Zionists believe that if they can provoke a nuclear world war, that all of the Gentiles will be destroyed, but the good ones will be raptured up into heaven and then will return in the Messianic era. And they're trying to push this. They're trying to push a nuclear war with Russia to fulfill these prophecies. And I think we make a mistake when we assume that intelligent people can't fall victim to these mythologies. And we make a mistake when we assume that Jews are smarter than everyone else and would never do anything this horrific because they're not as silly as these goggly-eyed Christian Zionists. But I think that people fall victim to these things, and when they are surrounded by Jews who are continually talking about these things, they start to assume that these things are natural, normal, and good. And I think that's what happened to Coudenhove-Kalergi. He was simply immersed in it, absorbed it, and then promulgated it.
Yeah, what's fascinating here too, for those that don't know or can't recall, the European Parliament building in Strasbourg obviously it basically symbolizes an unfinished building, right? It evokes the idea that the Tower of Babel is being built. It actually looks somewhat similar to a painting that Peter Bruegel the Elder actually did. I forget exactly what year he did that, but it's remarkable how similar those two buildings are. There's even actually older pamphlets released. I think it's the 70s or maybe early 80s that shows this very building, like the building of the tower, and they released it in unison with a with a plaque or whatever that's called. Is on it. It said Europe, many tongues, one voice, kind of evoking this idea of a well, obviously it's a biblical mythological narrative that's being inserted into all of this, isn't it?
Yes, and in the Bible it specifies that in the end times there will be only one language, one tongue,
Right. Yeah.
and one God. And I think one of the principles I would like to convey to your audience is the idea that the Jews believe in the idea of as above, so below. And they feel that there are many gods. They are actually not monotheists. And they think that each individual creature is represented by an angel in the heavens, and that each nation is represented by its national god. And they think that by converting Gentiles to Jewish religions, they kill off their national protective gods in the heavens. And that by killing off their national protective gods in the heavens, as above, so below, they will kill off and exterminate the people themselves. And you'll see that reflective in a lot of what they do. And by eliminating people's languages and their protective national spirits, they are eliminating their supernatural protections and their connections with their own heritage to the point where people become malleable to be reformed into whatever it is that the Jews want to form them into. And what the Jews form them into after they have abandoned their indigenous national heritage is adopting the Jewish national heritage, which is one in which Jews dominate the world and are worshipped as a master race, and all other races are taught that it is evil to preserve themselves and that it is goodness for them to mix with one another so that they can harbor no animosity towards each other. And part of the whole process of creating the world wars was to create wars that were so horrible that people would clamor for peace. And then the Jews proposed the idea that the only way to ultimately achieve peace, the peace of Isaiah, is to destroy all nations so that there are no warring factions. And then now that they are being successful in destroying nations, they want to destroy all races, all languages. And they keep ratcheting it up to the point where nothing exists but that which they create as being beneficial to them.
So do you think this is really messianic Jewish prophecy that needs to play out here, or is it because what's
well, when you say
yeah,
needs to play out, I think you're falling into their trap. They themselves decided with Moses Hess and with the Rothschilds that they would be their own Messiah, and that they would no longer wait. They had waited almost 2,000 years for God to intervene in the works of men and bring about the messianic prophecies. And Moses Hess redirected that into the idea that the Bible had been created by the Jews' racial instincts, that each people has racial instincts which manifest themselves in their religions and in their prophetic writings, and that the Jews had done this. And therefore it was incumbent upon the Jewish people to be its own Messiah. And that is when you really started to see events get horrific in Europe, is when Moses Hess inspired Karl Marx to make Jewish messianic prophecies into political movements. And the two political movements that spawned, which generated so much bloodshed in the 20th century, were Zionism and Bolshevism. Zionism was Jewish messianic prophecy made real for the Gentiles, where they would destroy their own governments in order to allow room for the Jews to rule over them. And Zionism was the Jewish messianic prophecy that the Jews would take over the covenant land of Palestine and the land from the Nile to the Euphrates for themselves as the seat of world government to rule over and eventually exterminate all the Gentiles. Those two movements, Bolshevism and Zionism, were made to appear to be in conflict, but they were forces working for the fulfillment of Jewish messianic prophecy.
So it's really a brilliant long-term plan, or do you think it's more that this is how things they've played with the things that have been to a certain extent both handed to them and what they've been able to create and adapted to the circumstances, and here we are today, right, on the path towards that goal, because it's not predicated on the fact that everything that they have set out to do was going according to plan, right? If you see what I'm saying, that they've adapted as much as they can to the circumstances to basically win over us, right?
They adapted to circumstances and they developed the means. Technology has provided them with the means that they lacked in prior epochs to fulfill their messianic prophecies themselves. Of course, there could be no supernatural intervention to manifest these horrific things. But eventually the Gentiles provided the Jews with the means to destroy them. They provided the psychological means, the technological apparatus, and the religious means, because Gentiles adopted Mohammedanism and Christianity, which themselves aspire to the same messianic prophecies.
Yeah, it's true. It's horrible bloodshed, and look at where we are in terms of that right now in Europe, and with the invasion, with the rise of Islam in Europe, and again, it's not the first time we're seeing this. Of course, it's reminiscent of it holds echoes of history, but the fact is, it's still a bit of a different. It's come in a different way. We have partially allowed this to happen. Yes, there are people that are responsible for pushing this upon us, of course, but we've also so far more or less gone along with this, right? We haven't set up a proper opposition to what's happening. Do you think that this is going to be a war at some point, civil war in Europe between Islamic forces and Christian and atheist Europeans, and then on the far side of this, you have a third component that is largely have instigated this to come about?
I think it will be a little bit more dynamic than that. And I think that people ought to understand that the Jews have a much higher regard for Islam and created Islam to destroy Christianity. The Jews have 613 laws as defined by Maimonides, whom they call Rambam. And they are obliged to follow those. And they say that Gentiles are lucky and only have 7 laws, which they call the Noahide laws. And Islam conforms to those 7 Noahide laws. And in Jewish history, they call their golden period the period in which they lived in the Ottoman Empire, and even before that, when they lived among the Moors and in Islamic culture.
Mm-hmm.
They considered that their golden age. So the mistake that Christians make is to believe that the Jews feel that Christianity is their guardian and that the Jews therefore want to protect Christianity. The Jews, in fact, want to destroy Christianity and want to make Islam the predominant world religion because it conforms to the Noahide laws. It is strictly monotheistic, and Christians worship a trinity. And the Jews believe that the saints and Jesus himself is a forbidden icon and an idol, and that Christians worship idols, and therefore Christians all have to be beheaded. So Europeans ought to be aware that signing on to Christianity will not protect you from the Jews. The Jews want the Muslims to destroy you and overwhelm your religion. Now, in terms of a civil war, I think that what is being set up is that there are Bolshevik forces out of Russia which are utilizing Muslims, especially Chechens, to provide opposition to the invasion itself. And it is a Bolshevik, Angela Merkel, and it is Bolsheviks in Sweden and Bolsheviks in England who are sponsoring the invasion. And Bolsheviks have always wanted Asians, Middle Easterns, and Africans to invade Europe and rape European women and destroy the national spirit and racial pride of Europeans. And there was a committee formed in the Soviet Union during World War II called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which has morphed into the Antifa. And this Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee put out leaflets among Soviet soldiers telling them to go into Germany and kill all the Germans and rape every single German woman. And they did. They went in, and in all the areas that the Soviets occupied, they raped every woman, from the smallest children to the oldest ladies, that they could lay hands on. And I think that this invasion of Europe is setting up a spread of a new Soviet Union, which will be headed by Russia. And Russia was always heavily under the control of the Jews. And they want there to be civil wars. So I think that the KGB is behind groups like Pegida and other groups that are fomenting civil unrest in Europe as a countermeasure to what the Bolsheviks did through Angela Merkel and others to bring the invaders in. So they are providing and financing both sides of this struggle to drive Europe into civil war. And they are very powerful forces, so I would assume that they are going to become successful. But the only counterbalance to that could potentially be in Donald Trump establishing a precedent of white people standing up for its heritage and fighting back against this invasion. And if Trump can then provide a stabilizing influence as opposed to a revolutionary influence, which is what the KGB is doing in Europe, then Europe can stabilize itself and get these invaders out in an orderly and humane fashion. And I hope that that is what happens. Because if Europe falls into civil war, what they're going to do is they're going to have the anti-invasion forces dismantle NATO, which is what Vladimir Putin and Alexander Dugin are doing, and why they finance people like the Le Pens to run for office, because they want the pro-NATO forces to invite in an invasion, and then the anti-NATO forces to be the opposition to that, so that they can dismantle NATO, so that when these civil wars break out, there will be no forces of defense from the Bolsheviks from Russia and China to come running into Europe and completely take it over. And I think their ultimate goal is to exterminate the white race in Europe and replace it with Chinese. Chinese have the largest population of any race on earth. And because of the musings of people like Einstein and like Georg Nikolai, I believe that that is what they're ultimately after, to get rid of whites through miscegenation and then through extermination. And the Bolsheviks showed through their whole history that they would always target the intelligentsia and try to create a eugenics program that would weaken the racial characteristics of whites, both by mixing them with what they consider to be inferior races and by killing off the best breeding stock of the white race.
Well, that's certainly happened throughout the many civil wars in Europe, the detrimental world wars.
Well, have you noticed? Have you noticed that the communists tend to create civil wars that become perpetual? You have North Korea and South Korea. You had North Vietnam and you had South Vietnam. You have mainland China and you have Taiwan.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, they keep them going. They instigate it.
East Germany, and West Germany. And it was Jewish forces that were behind the Civil War in the United States. So they are very clever at pitting a people against itself to consume itself, and not only to consume itself, but to consume its best citizens first.
Yeah. Jeez. I mean, there's so many things here that we can discuss in detail of what you just mentioned. A lot of interesting ideas, but I think one of the main things here to discuss a bit more about is in some regards how open many people are allowed to be on this front. We've spoken about many of these promoters many times, but it's always good to run through some of them. Of course, we have Kalergi, as you mentioned, part of this international guard that kind of sets the precedents in the early days of openly talking about it. But we have Wesley Clark, who also was Jewish, that spoke earlier during the Balkan Wars about how the idea of nationalism and the idea of these homogenous countries at that time is over. You've had professors
and promoting the invasion of Islam, the supremacy of Islam in Southern Europe with Albania and with Kosovo.
Yeah, the support, suppressing Serbians, right, Christians, and then supporting the Bosnians, and making sure that. And again, it's these scenarios when they arise. It's always that they claim, well, here's an aggressor, and we have to protect the people from this evil aggressor. It's like, well, wait a minute, what was like Milosevic reacting to? What was he? Why was he doing what he was doing? Right? There's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that there was people being slaughtered that comes through religious conflict, and he was just simply lashing out, and he wasn't this wicked, evil, Hitlerian dictator that they like to point him out to be. So there's a lot more behind the surface here, I think.
Well, the whole formation of Yugoslavia went against the nationhood of Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Serbia, to create a multicultural society, borderless society. It was in itself sort of a pan-European mini-union of antagonistic forces, and it was artificial. And Tito held it together for a very long time. But when it split, the ancient antagonisms manifested themselves again.
Yeah.
And we took sides. And what we took sides against were the Christians and in favor of the Muslims.
Yeah. Very interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
It's bizarre. And of course,
and before that, they suffered for hundreds of years under the Ottoman Empire and maintained them.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So they had developed both the racial stock and the traditions of maintaining themselves under the oppression of an overarching empire. So they were strong, and they had to be crushed, just as the Japanese now are being destroyed because they have ancient national traditions to preserve themselves and prevent immigration. And there are now strong communist and internationalizing forces in Japan at their weakest moment.
That's right. Yep, that's right. Yeah, I mean, they can keep the lid on it for a while. They can adopt a kind of a communist dictatorship that keep things in check, but basically for a while. But as you say, as soon as this releases, or as soon as there's democracy or liberal forces coming in, it's a recipe for disaster. And again, since Europe already is so liberalized, we're seeing it immediately right out the gate. Some of these people are not even placed and housed properly yet before they're like beginning to lash out and throw stones at cops, and many of them are raping, and many of them are just it's a recipe for disaster. And you still have forces within the European population that are openly advocating and pushing for it and think it's going to be the greatest thing ever. It's disaster, Christopher.
It is disaster, and you were primed for it. I have young children at my old age, and when I watch some of the programs that come out of Sweden, you always see the young white male as being goofy, as being a bully, as being stupid. And then the white female is a little bit better and is always the instructor instructing the white male how to behave. And then the superior one is the wise old foreigner, usually with brown skin, who is the wise, gentle, cultured, sophisticated leader of everything. And I see that again and again in children programming. And in America here, they try to teach our kids Spanish and how to play with kids who aren't white.
Yep.
And so people have the expectancy that when these brown-skinned foreign people come into the nation, they will be these gentle, wise, helpful, kind people. And it is not the reality. The reality is in America, we import the worst of the Mexican population and the Asian population. And in Europe, you are getting floods of the worst of the young males of the populations of these other cultures. Now, there is high culture in many of these nations, but in many of these nations, there is not. And you are essentially dealing with savage people coming from savage cultures, and they cannot incorporate into the high culture of Europe and benefit it. It is counter-scientific to expect that they will. Science says that North Europeans have very high IQs and have stable personalities, which have evolved over thousands of years into stable societies. That is what science shows, and we have a right to look to science as evidence that what is taking place is malevolent and is designed to destroy all the good, not to create a greater good.
Yeah, I mean, it's beyond remarkable. It's just unfathomable. I don't know why it's happening. I think you're right though when you say that the perception is that somehow this is going to be like, it's like a big cuddly brown teddy bear, right? That you let into your home, and despite all this, there's countless of stories of women who are letting them into their families, and they end up molesting them or raping them or attacking their children and stuff like that.
That's one half of it. What you described is one half of it, that it's this big cuddly teddy bear who's going to make their lives better. The other half of it is that they are the evil whites who have colonialized and oppressed all these people and caused all the evil in the world. The media is constantly attacking white people, especially the leading class of white males, as if they are evil by nature, evil by race, and evil by history. And that these people are doing a good thing by committing suicide and destroying themselves for the benefit of a greater good. And I think that was one of the horrific things that Christianity has done to the white mind, is replace the goodness of race with the goodness of a spiritual world, and that there is a higher court who is judging people. And people feel that they will be judged in this higher court by sacrificing themselves as being good, by being in opposition to their own race, in opposition to their own nation, in opposition to their own heritage, and in opposition to their own territory. They feel that by inviting in their enemies, that they will then be judged by the higher court to be superior and will obtain eternal life in a heavenly world.
Right, exactly. It's a religious sense of salvation, a kind of a purging of the original sin of whiteness that can only take place in adoption, or allowing migrants into your country or something. That it's a sin that has to be cleansed. We have to be cleansed of it, and this is the only way it can take place, right? So even I think that's also why there is a willingness to obviously look in the opposite direction, right? Because
to cover up the horrendous reality of what it is. Because once you break the illusion, you get people thinking logically. And when people think logically, even if they still accept the idea that there is a higher court, they will then say that this higher court is going to judge these savages harshly, and that it is these people who deserve damnation and not them, that it is these people who are evil. And hey, maybe it will occur to them that their ancestors weren't so stupid when they kept these savages separate from themselves, when they maintained their own high culture and said that we don't want these other people corrupting us. Maybe their ancestors had a point, and maybe it is these people who are bad and should be kept away from their children and away from their women. And even if these people aren't bad, maybe there's something good about themselves that their racial instincts should cause them to preserve. So when the illusion that has been created by media and Jewish educational institutions is broken, then we have an opportunity to get people thinking about themselves again and admiring their ancestors instead of hating them, and thereby admiring themselves instead of seeking to commit suicide to obtain salvation. And I think you hit the nail on the head. They see themselves as the new Christian martyrs, and they are throwing themselves to the lions of a foreign invasion.
Yeah. I mean, I wish it wasn't so, right? I mean, and yes, not everyone is a bad person. Not everyone is a rapist, but let's face the reality of what has happened, what we can observe so far. The willingness to play Russian roulette effectively with the future of our children and civilization, European Western civilization, that there's no weighing the supposed benefits of this against what actually you're seeing taking place. I mean, the conditions at some of these, camps, asylum homes, and it's beyond horrible. They're not only turning on the native population, they're turning on themselves. There are children and old women in some of these places that are getting raped as well. And
They're bringing it with them. They're bringing it from
Right.
Pakistan.
Yeah.
They're bringing it from Senegal, from the most horrific places. You are inviting these people in to come and take what you have. I don't understand it. I don't understand why people would do that. Why give away what your ancestors worked so hard to defend and build?
Yeah.
And the reason is brainwashing. They are psychotic in their thinking.
To a certain extent, I think that in some of the countries that they come from, there are very harsh punishments for some of these behaviors, and they would never do it in their own countries. But all the inhibitions are let go once they come into ours, liberalized, soft, even the culture shock of how women dress. Many of these things are an invitation to behave in this way, right? It's kind of like what's going on in some of these bathhouses. I don't know what the hell it is with these bathhouses, but it keeps coming out, these stories of some of these people they're defecating on the side of the pool, they're molesting children, they're masturbating in the showers, there's like groping of both adults and also of children and stuff like that. And it's like, I think this type of behavior surely wasn't that bad in their own country, or was it, do you think? It's just that we never heard about it.
I think it is. I've known people who've been to Pakistan and many of these places, and to Afghanistan, and there were U.S. soldiers who witnessed boys being chained to the bed of Afghani commanders and tried to intervene and free these sex slaves, and were reprimanded for it. So I think you might be a little bit naive as to what goes
Right.
on in those countries.
Yeah.
But I think your insight is powerful and brilliant, that they feel uninhibited when they reach this paradise. Not only do they not have to work to earn an income, but they can behave in this way. And I think one of the things that you're aware of that you didn't mention is that the government protects them from their crimes.
Yes.
In England, these rape gangs, when the parents reported this to the police, it is the parents that were threatened with arrest, not the rape gangs.
That's right.
And the authorities deliberately covered it up. And that gave these Muslims a sense of empowerment, and a religious sense of empowerment, because Islam teaches that they have the right to do these things to the infidels. And the government itself is reinforcing that. So it becomes a cascading effect where all of these societal influences justify this perverse behavior. So it increases it.
Yep. Look at Sweden. We had a story coming out a few weeks ago now about how the Swedish police are actually actively covering up if the crimes involve, these, supposed refugees, these migrants, these invaders. The code was 291, right? So everyone, or if they discover that the crime involves one of these people that are specially protected, talk about privilege, by the way, who are specially protected within our society. If they commit crimes, they name it, they put the 291 code in connection to the crime, and voila, everything disappears and it's swept under the rug and no one can talk about it, to actively prevent people from actually speaking out and discovering what the true nature of many of these people are. I mean, that's the state and the security in Sweden specifically have openly now said that they basically can't guarantee the safety and security of their own people anymore. This is the government abdicating the right to be in a position of having monopoly violence and enforcing that on people, right? They have effectively broken the contract between people and state, as far as I'm concerned.
But only in terms of the invading force. If a white Swede who has been a Swede for 1,000 generations breaks the law, then the state apparatus is very strong and very powerful and will come down with a heavy hammer on that man.
Absolutely.
What they are is an enemy army. Your government has become an enemy army, imposing this enemy force upon you.
And they're specially protected, and the aspect that the Swedish state and the authorities are now worrying about is mobilization of the native Swedish population against this invasion, right? They even we have this famous case in Sweden going back to, I forget exactly when it was early 1900s, maybe a bit later. There was a demonstration by, a union, there was at a mine, a metal, iron ore mine, or metal, or whatever you call it. And you had a group there that were protesting the state. It was there was a communist faction within this, right? And what happened is that eventually became so bad that the military opened fire against these people, and one was killed. Ever since that time, and this took place in a small town up in northern Sweden called Ådalen. So one of the standing kind of phrases that you've heard from the socialist and communist left in Sweden has been, never forget Ådalen, right? It was set as a precedence of why the military should never be deployed against its own people. Fair enough. I understand the point. Despite the fact that you might, have an interest, a government might want to have an interest in protecting itself against a people that is trying to topple it, etc. But nonetheless, it's been there.
That's it.
But,
that's the point, is that the next logical step from that is that the people have a right to revolt and attack the government.
Right.
That's
right.
what the communists were leading up to. I'm sorry for
Exactly.
interrupting.
No, it's fine. No, you're right. And so what happened is that this law was actually revoked a couple of years ago. I think it's 2 years exact that this was revoked, which means that, again, now the military is allowed to be deployed against its own people. And it's worse than that. The military in Sweden have now actually done active training and drills involving, some so-called of these national, surgeons or a rise of nationalistic sentiments within the country, and how the military should be deployed against those people to take care of that problem. I think the pieces on the chessboard is pretty much lined up and set, and they're just waiting for this to begin to happen, basically. So they know what's going to happen. They know the response. And so the logic follow-up question to all of this is, of course, okay, so are they creating conditions where they're awaiting for a response, which can trigger the ultimate purging of some of these few remaining, sources of nationalist sentiments? Or where do you think this is going, if this is also occurring in other countries?
That's why I am very concerned about the promotion in the alternative media of Vladimir Putin as the savior of Europe, because he is involved in funding and organizing the groups which are going to revolt against the tyranny that is being imposed upon you. And it is a classic Bolshevik maneuver to set up both forces so they consume one another. And then the Bolshevik armies, with its masses of people from China and Russia, will have an easy time coming in and taking you over. And even if you're able to defeat this oppression that you face from the Swedish government, and God forbid it ever comes to that, they will then have superior forces to come in, and it is the Swedish government which will invite those forces in to attack you. When you start to see United Nations forces and other things moving into Sweden, you should be especially cautious.
Absolutely. I raised this concern on another show recently, and I still think it's a valid point that, and it's effectively what you're saying here, of course, but this very idea that the conditions within Europe are going to be so bad, and they already are, in fact, that you naturally and understandably and frankly absolutely righteous as well reaction to this, right? So that what happens if Europe cleans up its act, so to speak, and decides to deal with this problem, almost kind of in a way of a larger version of what Germany did after the Versailles Treaty and the First World War and all this stuff, right? That they took measures to target those that they saw were responsible for the mess and specifically for the utter degeneracy of what was going on in Berlin at the time, etc. All these things that we've people can read about. What if that happens on a larger scale in Europe, that we decide to go together, operate together, we organize, we coordinate things, we actually throw out people that we feel have entered into Europe unlawfully and during a time now of this mass invasion, etc. I mean, you might be right in this regard. What if the internationalists, the rest of the world, with even African populations, Indians, Pakistani, Chinese, Asian, maybe even North America, who knows? I guess that depends on Trump or what as an interesting variable there. But what if they all in unison turn against Europe in the same way that we saw the world turn against Germany during the Second World War?
Well, that's what worries me about this Putin worship, is that they are now celebrating the idea of being anti-Western. That is a buzzword for them. They hate the West. Now, what is the West? We are the West. they are also provoking you to hate and destroy yourselves. So what has to come about is an authentic, not even really an opposition, but simply an authentic European movement that is political in nature and that receives funding from the wealthy class to preserve Europe. And I think the best way to bring that about is to take a page from the Jews' tactics book and to portray yourself in the victimhood in which you are faced, to point out the fact that these people are committing genocide against you, and to point to the authors of this genocide, as you're doing with Coudenhove Kalergi, Georg Nikolai, and Albert Einstein, and all these people who are becoming icons to our people, to point out that this is an organized effort to genocide you. Because the one thing that they have made all these liberals sensitive to is the idea that genocide is evil. So you're going to get their neurons exploding when you start to point out the fact that all the things that these people claim to be defending, they themselves are perpetrating.
Right.
And if you can do that and start to win over some of the wealthy class in Sweden who is now against the Swedish people to be for the Swedish people, I think you have better hopes than latching on to KGB assets of Vladimir Putin. But if it comes down to a fight, you have to fight. You have to struggle for your survival.
Well, see, this is it, and this is kind of what I'm struggling with too. Some people raised it as a kind of they thought they made a smart point or something at me that I'm like, oh, you're walking into a trap with these, Zionist promoted nationalist parties in Europe, and it's like, well, we've talked about that for years as a concern that yes, there is in effect a controlled opposition that's on the rise, but then
be smarter than them.
Right.
Be smarter than take it over. Take their money and take it over.
Right.
Be smart. Be organized, and be aware of what historical forces are working so that you can smell it. It all has a smell to it. The smell of Zionism and the smell of Bolshevism are very potent odors, and you can utilize them for your benefit. We've got to utilize our supposedly superior North European intellects, and we have to stop utilizing them against ourselves.
Yeah.
And we have to utilize our inborn compassion for humanity in a tribal way so that we become compassionate to our own people and realize that our compassion for ourselves and our own compels action against our enemies.
Absolutely. The ability to organize, cooperate, go together, and pull the string, pull in the same direction. And that's also another point that actually worries me, because I see such tremendous bickering and fighting over the smallest little details when people more or less are on the same page in so many different aspects, but they decide to picker,
That's where you smell it, especially if they get you arguing over the meaning of words, like what is a Jew, what is a Zionist, what is a communist, what is the West. Anybody who comes in and wants you to bicker over semantics or parse words is very likely working for your enemies to break apart your organization. And I am not saying what I'm saying about being where to keep you from acting, but to make your actions productive and to ensure that your actions are productive. And I don't think it would be productive to get rid of NATO. It will be productive, highly productive, to get rid of the EU. But I think the communists are trying to drive a wedge in NATO between Greece and Turkey so that they can take over the Middle East and then completely cut off Europe from energy. And what state will Europe be in when it is flooded with Muslims and has no access to cheap energy?
Yeah, there are a lot of variables that are very worrying here, isn't it?
Absolutely. So I think my suggestion to Europeans is get busy right now, because you are under direct attack and you are being slaughtered and you are losing. And you have to wake people up. And the best way to wake them up is to expose them to the irrefutable facts. They can see you must see what's happening and see the changes that are taking place. What you have to come to understand is why these changes are taking place and what the ultimate goal of imposing these changes on Europe is. And the ultimate goal of imposing these changes on Europe is to exterminate the indigenous population.
And, I wanted to bring that up earlier. I was heading in that direction, but obviously you mentioned some historical characters that have been involved in promoting this. We've talked about some of them, but, I brought up Wesley Clark, but there's more. In America, you have Noel Ignatieff of MIT. You have, of course, Barbara Specter and Ingrid Lundfors in Sweden. You have Gregory Gysi and Annette Kahane in Germany. There's a slew of these people that are quite openly talking about this from a strategical point of view, that this is the goal, or the fact that, like, we want to end your dominance, we want to end who you are, we want to try to eradicate whiteness and all these kinds of things that they're using. So it's openly.
They make it trendy and fashionable. Just as
Right.
at the height of the Vietnam War, they made it trendy and fashionable to support communism. Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh became cult figures in the dissenter class. Now, I am not trying to justify our intervention in Vietnam, but you can see how they turn a people against itself and make the citizens the enemy of the state and the state the enemy of the citizens in order to destroy a society. And I am cautioning people not to fall into that trap. Do not make a hero out of Vladimir Putin. He is another Che Guevara. He is another communist dictator who does not have your best interests at heart. And his political philosopher, Alexander Dugin, is vehemently and viciously anti-Western. And when I say anti-Western, I mean Swedes, Norwegians, Danish, English, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, etc., French, etc., etc., etc. They are your enemies, not your saviors.
And you think that is just not part of the rhetoric of the fact that this is modernity? It's what the West represents today in terms of the enforcement of liberalism, political correctness, of military power in other regions that ultimately
No, all that's true. All
Right,
that's true.
right.
But who are the instigators of all that? It is not Western tradition that is the instigator.
No, of course not.
George Washington was vehemently opposed to American interventionism in the foreign wars. It is the Jewish lobby which overwhelmingly took over our society in the 20th century, and the neoconservative Trotskyite Jews of the same bloody red strain as Vladimir Putin that created these permanent wars and permanent revolutions, all based on Kabbalistic Jewish messianic prophecies to create permanent instability in order to destroy primarily Europe, because Europe destroyed the Jewish temple and sent the Jews into a diaspora. They want to undo what they view as that injustice. And the way that they are going to get back at Europe is to exterminate Europeans. They want to get back at Europe for dismantling the temple in 70 AD and sending the Jews into the diaspora.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up the siege of Jerusalem. That's where it all goes back to, isn't it? There's a lot of things that happens after that point. Just a big mess. Because I was
and before that point, the Antiochus Epiphanes.
Antiochus, yeah, exactly.
Yes,
yeah.
The fourth slaughtered a pig in the Jewish temple and put in a statue of himself as a god, as did later Caligula, as was the Roman emperor's prerogative and as was normal in the ancient world. He wanted to be worshipped as a god.
And let me add, and look at what the Zionist establishment have done today in the White House, right? I mean, if the White House doesn't represent, if that isn't a temple, if you will, to Western power, right, then what else would be? It's even in Palladian architectural style. There's a lot of things behind this, but nonetheless, the placement of a menorah on the White House lawn that's being ceremonially lit every year in commemoration of the slaughter of these Greeks, right? That's putting their idol in our temple, if you will, right? It's a counter move. That's how I see it here.
Absolutely. And Disraeli said that, look at the Vatican, where you have a Jew worshipped as God, and all of the Roman gods have been destroyed. And it is a form of sympathetic magic to place the menorah in the White House, because that symbol then becomes the reality of Jewish international rule, and that symbol represents the extermination of the Greeks. If you read the Jewish books, the Jewish biblical books of the Maccabees, they are celebrating the complete genocide of Hellenes, killing off of all the Greeks and destroying their Greek culture. And the reason that those Maccabees revolted against the Greeks was the fact that the Jews were starting to view Greek culture as superior to Jewish culture. And the Hellenes were very kind to the Jews and invited them into their society. Now, the Jews saw that kindness as an evil, which was causing the genocide of the Jewish race through assimilation. So they killed not only the Hellenes, but all of the Jews who had assimilated into Hellenistic culture. The Maccabees not only celebrated the genocide of the Greeks, but also the genocide of all of the assimilated Jews who had assimilated into the superior Hellenistic culture.
Yeah.
And they did the same thing in Russia when the Tsar started to welcome in Jews to assimilate. And the Tsar emancipated not only the serfs, but the Jews, and began to break apart the Pale of Settlement and all of the ghettos so that the Jews began to become assimilated. They began to hate the Tsar, and they overthrew the Tsar and destroyed him to end that process of assimilation. That is what the Jews hate the most, is for Jews to be racially integrated into other people, or even to be exposed to the culture of other people. And that is what the menorah celebrates in its highest form, is exterminating other people so that Jews are never exposed to any other genes or any other culture, and maintain themselves as Jews. They view that as a form of self-preservation. And they believe that the only ultimate form of self-preservation is to exterminate all Gentiles.
The punishment is because of the kindness, that those that actually let them in are those that they, well, at least first turn on.
Those are their worst enemies.
Yeah.
People who are kind to Jews are their worst enemies. And that's why Christian Zionists ought to be very wary, because they are ultimately hoping to convert Jews to Christianity, and they are helping and empowering the Jews to reach such a powerful force that they will then be able to exterminate the Christian Zionists. And they have the Christian Zionist churches all under their control. They are completely dominated by people with close ties to the Israeli establishment, and they are funded by them, and they have been made famous by them, and they have been schooled by them. And many of the books that they read have been published by these Zionist Jews or people working for these Zionist Jews. And the Jews hate most those who are kind to them, because that kindness invites in mixture. And the Jews have many laws to prevent the mixture of Jews with non-Jews. They will not eat at the same table with non-Jews. They will not allow any religious doctrines, and for thousands of years, not even scientific doctrines, to enter into their synagogues, which are schools. They do not want the Jews to lose anything Jewish about themselves. And their ultimate goal is to exterminate everyone else in order to preserve themselves.
Now, is this primarily true for the most vehemently religious Jews, or what about the liberals, right, and those behind Reform Judaism, etc.? Do they ultimately agree with a lot of the things you've been talking about here, do you think, or is there schism within the group?
The modern liberal Jew is a product of what happened when Shabbatai Tzvi became the Messiah of the Jews and said that the Jews now have to take Palestine. And they created the sect of Hasidic Jews. And the counterbalance to the Hasidic Jews was the Reform Jews of Moses Mendelssohn. But those Jews were sent in to Western civilization to subvert it from within. And there was a precedent for that. When the Jews were persecuted in Spain, there was a famous letter written that said that the Jews should enter into all the professions. They should enter into the court so that they could poison the kings. They should become doctors so that they could kill any Gentiles who were their enemies. They should become teachers so that they could subvert the educational process of Gentiles and make them enemies of themselves, and subvert their own interests for the benefit of the Jews. And there was a long list in this letter of what the Jews should do, and that's what they've done. And Moses Mendelssohn facilitated that by creating Reform Judaism, which then allowed Jews to enter into Christian universities by either faking to be Christians in those countries which prohibited Jews from entering the universities, and from more liberal states simply entering into the universities as Reformed Jews and being able to sit next to Gentiles and eat with Gentiles in Gentile cafeterias. That was a necessary process for them to infiltrate Gentile society, and that's how the modern liberal Jew was formed. And then the modern liberal Jew came in and took over the mass media to promote all kinds of self-destructive ideas among Gentiles.
Give us the name of the letter again. I missed that.
Oh, it was sent from a chief rabbi to someone in Spain, to the Jews of Spain who were complaining about it. It's contained in a book called Waters Flowing Eastward.
Right, yeah.
Which republishes the protocols, but it also has that letter in it. And I can't remember the specific. I think it was a letter to the rabbi of Toledo or something like that.
Also, it's way back then, huh? Because that's I've brought that up too in many shows, but it's a very interesting history of what happened to the Visigoths and to what later became the Spanish kingdom. How the cooperation took place with the Muslim invaders, how the gates to many of these cities were opened, etc., and how they actually quite openly brag about that today, right? That this was a great thing. These evil Visigoths try to have them convert and abide by the same rules as everybody, to convert to Catholicism or convert to kind of new Christianity, right? So that was seen, as far as I understood it, as such an offense to the fact that they couldn't remain who they were, so they wanted to like destroy everything they had built as a kind of a punishment for even suggesting this idea, right?
That's why they had to flee Spain. That's why they sent the Jew Christopher Columbus to America to create the New Jerusalem. The Spanish were becoming very open to Jews and allowing Jews to assimilate. And whenever that happens in a society, the Jewish elders sponsor what they claim is anti-Semitism to expel the Jews so that they no longer assimilate and lose their Jewishness. And King Ferdinand's father was a Jew. And it was the Ottoman Empire who welcomed them in. And somebody from Nasi, I forget his name, set up the Ottoman Empire and ingratiated himself to the Sultan by giving him large sums of money, and then invited in the Jews from Spain into the Ottoman Empire, where they then used the Ottoman Empire as a weapon against the Europeans.
So do you think this all goes back to the destruction of the temple in 70, or because, you know, researchers
much before that? All of their books,
right. Mm-hmm.
If you read the Old Testament, state that the messianic mission of the Jews is to exterminate the Gentiles and create world rule from Jerusalem and messianic peace for 2,000 years. And they break down the ages of the universe into 2,000-year periods. And they say that the foundation of man with Adam was a 2,000-year period. And then Moses on was a 2,000-year period. And now Christianity is a 2,000-year period. And that each one of those 2,000-year periods adds up to 6,000 years. And we are now entering the seventh day, the Sabbath day, the 7,000-year millennium, which they say will be the messianic 1,000 years of peace. And in order for that to be obtained, the Gentiles have to be exterminated, and the Jewish king has to rule from Jerusalem. And it's all in the Old Testament for people to read. Just as usury is stated 3 times in Deuteronomy, that they should utilize usury to take over all the nations and become the rulers of the earth, the head and not the tail. They cannot practice usury against fellow Jews, but they are compelled by God to practice it against Gentiles as a means of taking over the world. This is not something out of the protocols. This is something out of the books of Moses.
Yeah, I think, isn't it, you spoke about the time and the calendar and all that stuff. I think it's the Freemasonic calendar, Anna Lucius, right? The year of light is...
Yes, that's very significant, because
right.
The year 2000 in that is the beginning of the Messianic age.
6016, I think it is today, according to that calendar.
Absolutely. And that is the calendar of Kabbalah and the calendar of Shabbatai Tzevi. That's how it got introduced to the Freemasons. That is the official calendar. The majority of Jewry is working off of an unofficial calendar, which the Jews in the know realize. And they think that the reason why this is being delayed is because they have not yet created enough turmoil in the world, which is why they created Freemasonry to introduce that turmoil. And that's what you're about to face in Europe.
Interesting. So it's a big Jewish conspiracy, isn't it? To be blunt.
It has been for 2,500 years, and
Right.
it's not hidden. It's not hidden.
Mhm.
All you have to do is read the Old Testament as if it's not the word of God, but the word of the Jews, and there it is. It's not a conspiracy, it's a plan. They call it a prophecy, but because there are not supernatural forces to bring it about, they're bringing it about themselves.
Right, exactly. They're manifesting this. Yeah, because I try to find a little bit in terms of what the what the beef really is about, right? Kevin McDonald speaks about group evolutionary strategy. There's different ideas here, but it's always interesting to try to figure out what is the motivating factor and stuff. But you think it's religious in nature, that this is that this is a commandment of sorts that was given, and they are trying to enforce that. Is that right?
But we have to understand religion as they understand religion, not as we as Europeans understand religion. Religion to the Jew is law and kingdom and war and genocide. When you read the Old Testament, it is not some metaphysical exploration of how the universe was created through whatever forces. That's a very, very small part of it. There's almost no metaphysics and no religion in the Old Testament. It is all about a jealous, angry God. And remember what I said before about as above, so below. Just as the Jewish God has to kill off all non-Jewish gods, Jews have to kill off all other human beings. As above, so below. And the Old Testament specifies that there will be a new heavens and a new earth. And by that, they mean a heavens in which only their God reigns and an earth in which only Jews reign. And ultimately, the only way for Jews to reign absolutely is to exterminate all non-Jews. And it's very clear again and again in the Old Testament. It is genocide after genocide. They were never the native inhabitants of Palestine. And the only way they could come to rule Palestine was to exterminate all of the indigenous peoples so that they could never, ever again in the future try to reformulate and retake the territories that they held.
Do you have you outlined, if you will, some of this chronology that we've been talking about in one of your books?
Yes, you'll find that in my book on Mileva Einstein, I talk a little bit about that. I talk more about it in Albert Einstein, the Incorrigible Racist, and in a PDF I have available online called The Manufacture and Sale of Sane Einstein, I lay it out in even further detail. And in many of my blogs, I have many series of blogs that talk about the universal enslavement of the non-Jew and many of the issues we're discussing.
Now, I feel always obligated to to ask in terms of how you view this aspect that every single Jewish person is in on this more or less in some way, which I don't think is the case personally. What do you stand on this?
No, and I know that they're not, because I can see the shock in their face when I say some of these things, but it is the Jewish people and the tradition of the Jewish people as a collective. This is their history, their tradition, and their mission. And even those who call themselves communists are pursuing Jewish messianic goals, whether they view it as being religious or whether they view it as being political, liberal, and philanthropic is irrelevant. They are destroying us and making themselves enemies by aspiring to these things which are engineered to kill us off. So we have to view what they're doing as an enemy pursuit. And we don't have to sort all that out. What we have to do is survive. And in order to survive, we're going to have to confront this enemy.
Yeah.
We don't have to be these great liberal philosophers that try to figure out what's in the mind of every single Jew. What we have to do is figure out how we're going to organize to preserve ourselves, the enemies that we confront, and how to shut those enemies down. We have to stop utilizing the alternative media as trying to sort out good Jews from bad Jews. That's not the issue. The issue is, how are we going to survive this attack on us?
Well, if we are under attack, we have to defend ourselves, and it doesn't matter if we wish it was or wasn't so. I think if someone has declared themselves, me, my people, and all that as enemies, then you have to deal with that situation, right? And you have to defend yourself and make sure to protect yourself against that. Because look at the end result at the end of the day, too, though, Christopher, of what we're seeing right now, that we are witnessing the utter breakdown of the European nations. And we also have in unison with that people that are openly talking and writing about this, and how they're trying to sell us the idea of how wonderful this is. So it is observably a reality. This is what's happening.
And almost every one of them is a Jew. I saw Larry King on CNN years ago promoting Obama as being this great figure because he was of mixed race, and how wonderful it would be when everyone is of mixed race. And what do they say is the benefit of this mixing of the races? Peace. Now that goes right back to their messianic prophecies, that the messianic era is to be an age of peace. And how do they get people to clamor for peace? They get people to clamor for peace by promoting and instigating war, and more horrific and genocidal wars, so that everyone will submit to the destruction of their own nations and their own race in the interests of finally obtaining peace. And they will ensure that that peace never comes about, because for them, peace is the extermination of Gentiles. So there will be no peace. They will pit us down to the last man against the last man, so that we fight each other to the death, and that they remain the last people standing. That is the agenda, and it is clearly stated in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it says we will bring brother against brother, and that they will use Esau as their sword and as their soldier and as their slave. Now, to the Jews, the twin brothers Jacob and Esau signify the Jews and the Gentiles.
Right. Yeah. Well, Christopher, we could obviously go on and on here for probably another hour at least. Let's let our audience ponder on some of the things we've been talking about here and let them digest this a bit. It's a lot to. I mean, we do speak on this topic now and then as well, so it's not all new, but you've put some new thoughts, I think, into our minds in terms of connecting some of the dots, basically historically, and tying that into, interestingly enough, also the context of science, which is a new angle, really. So why don't we do this? Let's talk a bit more about some of the books, so people know where to go if they want to try to read some more of this for themselves, and check out your work, check your sources, and try to in one way or another confirm this for themselves, right? So they can validate this. So give us some of the details again, where people can go to read more.
I have links to my books on my website, jewishlacism.blogspot.com, and Jewish racism is spelled out as if it were one word. Probably the best way to get directly to my books is to go to Amazon.com and put in my name, Christopher Jon, Jon Bjerknes, Bjerknes.
All right. Very good. Well, I think this is, as I said, very interesting. I'd love to have you back, in future shows here and talk a bit more about this, and also actually go into a little bit more detail on your book on the Jewish genocide of Armenian Christians. I think that's a topic that we haven't really spoken enough about, and it's very interesting what you alluded to. Also, of course, in terms of the Young Turks and the history there. There's a lot to go over there.
Oh, absolutely. I welcome the opportunity anytime. And thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it, and it was a wonderful interview.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you absolutely. You too. Thank you. It was great having you here. As I said, I've wanted to have you on for some time. Is there any? I mean, we can have you back. We can let, as I said, let people mull on this for a little bit, but and at a later time, I think we can have you back and talk a bit about some of the things that you suggest people do, etc. But is there any, I guess, closing words that you'd like to leave us with here before we wrap up?
Yes. If you find what I am saying shocking, see if it is as shocking as what you see happening to your nations. Does it not shock you more that your children are now in schools with people from other countries who are subverting your culture, subverting your language, bringing in their foreign diseases and attacking your children, bullying your children in their own homeland? Would your ancestors have tolerated that? And stop hating your ancestors. Become more like your ancestors. Preserve yourself. The only reason you exist is because your ancestors fought this in the past. And if you want to have descendants, if you want to have grandchildren who look like you and who look like your ancestors and think like you and occupy the lands that your ancestors claimed, then you have to stand up as they did and defend yourselves.
Well said. Good job. Thank you so much, Christopher, for doing the work you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Well, I hope you learned from today's program. Thank you so much for listening. We have much more coming in the week ahead, so please stay tuned. A special thanks to all our members for your continued support and for being there for us. We have some updates planned for the websites. We're going to do the members website right after an update on redicecreations.com and give some even more enticing and hopefully enjoyable additions as well to all our wonderful members. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and we will speak more soon. Thank you again, and my thanks to the team. Take care.